So just a little bit information about our presenter today, Dr. Debbie Reese, tribally enrolled at Nambé Pueblo, a sovereign native nation in northern New Mexico. Dr. Debbie Reese's research interests include the representations of Native Americans in children's and young adult literature, textbooks, curricular materials, and/or other forms of media used in the classroom. Her materials and reviews have appeared in print and online academic journals and publications used by teachers and librarians that work with children. Her blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, is widely recognized as a go-to resource for people who create or teach children's literature. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Debbie Reese.
All right, my turn to share screen. And I'm glad that we saw that it was your microphone was dropping out. So I will be paying attention in case that happens now with my presentation. I will say I'm shaking. I'm always quite anxious about presentations. I want them to go well. Sometimes they don't. Some things happen. So anyway, thank you for coming today. You're looking at my title slide, Teaching Children About Native Americans, Choosing Children's Books for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity. Now I'm going to see if I can minimize the photos on, there we go. All right. Okay, I can't see anybody now. I just see the little note that says I am talking. So here we go. This is my original starting slide. I'm going to come back to the content of the slide in just a moment. Because of something that happened yesterday, I decided I wanted to bring that to you right away. Every year, Native parents share these kinds of worksheets. Teachers send them home during this month because it is Native American Heritage Month, and teachers in early childhood classrooms are trying to plan activities for kids in their classroom to do because it is Native American Heritage Month, and because there is such a lack of knowledge about who we are. These worksheets go home and they are deeply, deeply problematic and harmful and hurtful. And Native parents share them in an effort to find each other as they and their families go through things like this. Now, what this one, and there are many versions of it, they are about naming. Now, there's a long history of Native people of our names being taken from us and being replaced by English names. My grandfather's surname, his last name, he was Hopi. His last name was Sakiestawa. When he went to boarding school, that name was taken from him and he was given a new name. His new name was Calvert. So there's a history of naming that's especially painful. And so to see exercises like this, where a teacher asks kids to think about various parts of their personality, their talents, and their interests in order to come up with a Native name is deeply problematic because it plays on stereotyping. As you read through the worksheet, you see that they're doing a feather project. And I think, what is a feather project? Don't they know that don't people know that feathers are of deeply religious significance to Native people? Obviously not. What's this headband that she's going to do? She's going to write these, once these kids in her classroom bring this worksheet back with their Indian name on it, with their Native American name, they're going to put it on a headband. That too is problematic. Headbands are part of traditional clothing. They are not a costume or they're not playful things. And then they're going to have some kind of a naming ceremony. And there are, in fact, within Native peoples and our communities, naming ceremonies. Most of you who are part of a religious group or church or synagogue or temple or any of those places where we go as peoples to worship, understand that naming happens in very special and significant ways. And so to try and have a naming ceremony in a school classroom that plays on stereotyping is deeply, deeply troubling to me and upsetting. So I shared this yesterday on Facebook and on Twitter, and it's going viral because some people are saying, who's still doing this? And other people are saying, what's wrong with it? It's pretty much embodying what I said earlier, that there's such a range of what people know and don't know about who we are. a few years ago, my cousin wrote to me, and her little boy had brought home one of these activities. Her little boy, of course, already had his native name, and being asked to pick a new name was just wrong, and he knew it was wrong, and they knew it was wrong. So it puts the families whose teachers are doing projects like this into a space where they have to accommodate what the teacher's doing or go to the classroom and talk with the teacher. It's just not an appropriate space for educators to be putting anyone into. That's upsetting. So I apologize. I am a little, I'm still sweating this one out. All right, so going to my title slide now. Gunta. Usually I begin my presentations quite enthusiastically saying Gunta. Today it's not quite that enthusiastic, but Kunta to the first 5 organizers of today's training for inviting me to visit with you today, and Kunta to all of you who's in this virtual gathering. What I'm saying is thank you for choosing to be here. I'm shaking. So I circled the word Kunta. I hope that most of you realized or understood that it means thank you. It does. It's thank you in the Tewa language. Tewa is our language at Nambé Pueblo. That's where I'm from, a sovereign native nation in what is currently called the state of New Mexico. When I say Tewa and when I say Nambé Pueblo, I'm being tribally specific. And that's really important because that's the thrust of what we're going to do today, is I'm asking you to move away from broad, generalized phrasing like Native American and American Indian, which are fine when you're talking about a broad group, but when you're talking about a family or a person, that's not fine. You have to be specific because we are citizens or tribal members of specific nations. We know what those nations are. We have languages, we have stories, we have all of the aspects of culture within our nations. And the problem with Native American and American Indian as phrases or categories is that it flattens out the diversity of who we are. So that's the thrust of what I'm trying to get at, is that diversity that is part of our lives. Our agenda for today is that I'm going to do a presentation where I will do an overview of stereotypes and bias, and I'm going to talk a little bit about best practice and what that means when you're talking about Native peoples. We're going to do about 30 slides in that area, and then we're going to have a small group time period where we're going to ask you to go into small groups. Leah's going to facilitate that, and you'll have about 10 minutes to share and talk about books that you have with you today. At that point, you'll have had a little bit of information about stereotyping and bias, and I would like you to apply that information to the small group breakout conversation you have with the book you have with you. And if you don't have one with you, we'll make some suggestions at that point in today's session. Then we're going to come back and have some discussion about your experiences with Native content and educational materials. Like if any of you are seeing those kind of Indian naming worksheets, I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear what people do and say about those when they occur. I'd also like to know if you're experiencing your experiences with Native content have to do with Columbus Day or Thanksgiving. So we'll come back to all of that in the second half of the session. Then we're going to move back into presentation mode where I'm going to go over criteria for evaluating Native content, and I'm going to be talking about exemplary children's books. We'll have a final discussion about what you learned today and how you might use that information to modify existing materials in your classrooms or in the libraries that you visit. So we're going to start with stereotypes and bias. Generally, we're talking about feathered headdress, sitting Indian style, crossed arms, how as a greeting, a bare torso or legs. And here's some examples. Now, what I'm going to start with are the books that the kids you work with are likely to get just because they live in the United States. Everybody shops at Walmart or Target or Kmart, if that's still around, stores like that where kids can get what we call mass-produced books. Parents are familiar with them. You're looking at on the left, I'm sure you know, that's Clifford the Big Red Dog, who is normally a cheery, happy-go-lucky dog. You can find Clifford the Big Red Dog books just about anywhere. The page you're looking at is from Clifford's Halloween. So one of the ways that stereotypes arise in the United States is around Halloween, because people think that it's perfectly fine to put on a feathered headdress and some kind of a cloth or robe and paint their face and be an Indian. it's really not okay. It's culturally wrong in many ways. Headdresses have tremendous significance, much as I started with, feathers are significant to us. We are the only people in the United States that can have eagle feathers, because they are a part of our religious structures. Our religious systems include eagle feathers. So they are things of religious significance, and to see these kinds of headdresses that crop up at Halloween are a problem. The other thing to note about Clifford there is that, like I said, usually happy-go-lucky dog is very sad, not very sad, he's very stern looking. See, he's not wide-eyed and smiling, he's got this different kind of demeanor on, because people think that Native Americans are stern, that we don't smile, that we're not happy, that we don't tell jokes, that we have no humor, and that's not true. That's a stereotype. I think that Clifford here with his little paw coming up is about to say how, because that is a common stereotype, that the way that Native Americans say hello is by raising that hand and saying how. I think that's what we see there with Clifford on that page in the book. And I think that thing in his mouth is supposed to be a peace pipe. So this particular image of Clifford embodies, captures, brings in a lot of the stereotyping that's out there. Same thing happens when kids go to camp. A lot of camps in the United States, they are supposed to be Indians. They go to a particular lodge or cabin, and that's who they're supposed to be, is that particular tribe. And you see storytelling that takes place. Here we have Grizzly Bob, again dressed up in a big feathered headdress, standing around a campfire, telling stories to the cubs who have assumed an Indian identity for these kinds of camp activities. That is wrong. Mercer Mayer, used to love Mercer Mayer, but then I started paying close attention to some of the content in some of the books. Here you see the characters playing cowboys and Indians. Not okay. You probably have kids who come into your spaces who have watched Peter Pan. Tremendous stereotyping that takes place in there. So not okay, Peter Pan. And when kids come to more formalized educational settings, kindergarten in particular, the teachers generally have training from their teacher education programs that teaches them to use what we call literature. So the top, Mercer Mayer and Berenstain Bears and Clifford the Big Red Dog, those are just mass produced at Kmart. James Marshall, on the other hand, is one of those books that we call literature. It's supposedly better than the average mass market books available. And so we have James Marshall on the left. He wrote the George and Martha hippopotamus books. In one of them, we see George playing Indian. This one that you're looking at now is from a book that was pushing against gender and racial stereotyping of African Americans. This is a page from Amazing Grace. In this particular part of the book, she imagines herself as being Hiawatha. And if you look at her, she's got her arms crossed. She's sitting cross-legged. She has a feathered headdress on. She has no clothes on top, and she has face paint on her face. She's looking very stern. Not okay. Beginning readers often have deeply problematic stereotyping in them. This page is from Danny and the Dinosaur, one that I remember from my childhood, and that sadly is in every public library even today. At this point of the book, Danny has gone into a museum where he sees Indians, bears, and Eskimos. All of that stereotypical. This is an alphabet book, so keep in mind that when you're looking at older alphabet books, this is not happening as much in more recent ones, but in older alphabet books that are classic, like this one, is this page, Imitating Indians, is from Mercer Mayer's Alligators All Around. Not okay. And then moving into another area where we see a lot of stereotyping is in historical fiction. The image you're looking at on the right is from Matchlock Gun. It won the Newbery Medal when it came out. And this whole story is about these brave and courageous pioneer families moving on to where? Indigenous or Native homelands, displacing Native people, attacking Native people, harming Native people. But the way these stories are told, we get the idea that these Indians are not quite human. Look at the bodies of these men. Look at their eyes. Look at their heads. They're not quite human. They're more monster-like. They're depicted in savage ways, in sharp contrast to the woman who is trying to get into her cabin there, and they're chasing after her. So we see that kind of problem in pioneer stories where Native peoples are depicted as the aggressors, when in fact what was happening was Pioneer families were moving onto their homelands, and Native people were trying to defend their homelands from those invasions. I want to spend a few minutes talking about Little House on the Prairie because this is one that's a touchstone for a lot of people in the United States. It is, of course, a pioneer story. And here we have, I'm going to share with you an activity on one screen that I normally do with a group in a classroom. That was pre-COVID. We would sit around together and read excerpts from pages in the book. Before we did that, we would do just a conversation about what was that story about. And most people have such fond memories of Little House on the Prairie. All they remember is the good things that Laura did and how courageous she was. People have fond memories of that. So it's a difficult one for most people to look critically at. But that's what I think is necessary, is to be able to see the problems that are in books like this that we have not been asked to look at before. So here is from one of the early parts of the book where the text says that Pa promised that when they came to the West, Laura should see a papoose. "What is a papoose?" she asked him, and he said, "A papoose is a little brown Indian baby." Lots of problems with that. In this, if this were an activity where we were all sitting together, we would talk about each of the passages that I'm going to share. A papoose is not a little brown Indian baby. Papoose is one people's word for baby. We don't all speak the same language. We all have our own words for baby. So papoose is a problem in here that most people don't notice as a problem. A little bit further into the story, that night by the fire, Laura asked again when she would see a papoose, but Pa didn't know. He said, "You never saw Indians unless they wanted you to see them." He had seen Indians when he was a boy in New York State, but Laura never had. She knew they were wild men with red skins, and their hatchets were called tomahawks. Pa knew all about wild animals, so he must know about wild men too. Laura thought he would show her a papoose someday, just as he had shown her fawns and little bears and wolves. Of course, obvious problems here are the depictions of Native people as wild men with red skins. Twice we see wild men. Again, the papoose is a problem in that passage too. Here is a part of the story where the kids are playing outside and Laura and her sister are being noisy. They forgot that the baby carrier was inside sleeping. And the highlighted text reads, "She," that's Laura, "jumped up and ran and shouted till Ma came to the door and said, 'Dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian? I declare, if you girls aren't getting to look like Indians, can I never teach you to keep your sunbonnets on?'" So what we have in that particular passage is that idea of yelling like a wild Indian. That's a very common phrase that you see on playgrounds and in parenting circles, that kids are yelling like an Indian. Obviously, that contributes to this idea of Native peoples being wild. And then that last part of that passage, that's a difficult one for me to talk about, I guess, because my daughter looks like an Indian. Don't you? It's you don't want your kids to look like an Indian. That's what Ma is saying. Put your sunbonnets on so you'll stay white in your skin tone. Teachers read this book to kids across the United States. Here's another passage. This is Mrs. Scott. She's saying, "The only good Indian was a dead Indian. The very thought of Indians made her blood run cold." And here's her husband, Mr. Scott. "The only good Indian's a dead Indian." And Pa says, "Well, I don't know. There might be some good Indians." And here's what Pa's talking about. At this point in the book, this is near the end of the book, these Indians have been going past the cabin. The family's been terrified for weeks. Every night they hear the war cries and the drums and the yipping and the yapping and the yowling that is coming from these Indians, who of course are more like wild animals than human beings. And Pa when we think about Pa, and when people say, "Well, but Pa likes Indians," Pa likes some Indians. He's at the end of the book, he's saying that's one good Indian. No matter what Mr. Scott said, Pa did not believe the only good Indian was a dead Indian. The good Indian to Pa is that you see on the top right corner of that image, those there's two men on horseback. That's the good Indian. That Indian has come into this story to fight these other Indians. That Indian is telling the Indians that are gathered around the fire that if they attack the Ingalls, Laura Weil Ingalls and her family, they will attack the Indians. So those Indians who are good Indians are going to side with and defend the little house on the prairie. That's a good Indian. The ones who are trying to protect their families are bad Indians. So I'd really like people to think very carefully at the kinds of messages that are packed into classic books that we have such warmth and such nostalgia for, like Little House on the Prairie. Today, there's more books by Native writers than ever before, and that gets me so excited. I hope you hear the little bit of joy in my voice, because you're looking at a screen load of books by Native writers that have come out in the last few years. All of them I have written extensively about in my books and book articles and chapters, and on my blog. So you could come to my blog and look for any of these books, and you'll find out why I think they're important books. They're all by Native writers. They're a wide variety of genres. If you like graphic novels, A Girl Called Echo on the bottom row towards the end, that's a graphic novel. If you like books about Native women who are getting into politics, the top row has Peggy Flanagan. That's an early reader. She's Ojibwe, and she's lieutenant governor in Minnesota. If you like books that are mysteries, Murder on the Red River is for adults, but it is a terrific book by an Ojibwe writer named Marcy Rendon. So these are all books that I recommend. They are terrific because they give you reality of who we are as Native people. But when teachers use these books in their classroom, their students will tell them, there were Native people in that book. Students think Native means long ago, people with feathers, hunting buffaloes, living in teepees. And if you're not that, if the character's not that, then it can't really be a Native. Stereotyping, it gets in the way of seeing us for who we are. Part of what you as an adult, as an educator, as someone who's working with young people has to do is begin the journey to being inclusive by acknowledging that all of these books here on this screen are not okay. You could come to my blog and you'll find writings about all of these books. I go through and point out the stereotyping. I go through and point out all the problems of bias and factual error in those books. So they're not okay. Yes, there's stickers on them to indicate that somebody at some point thought these were noteworthy books, but I have no doubt that none of these books would get awards today. So I want you to think critically about your attachments to some of these books and that they're not okay. And then I want you to set them aside. Stereotypical imagery and biased history has a negative impact on what non-Native and Native children think about Native people and history. So these are not just stories. They're shaping kids' minds. They can put non-Native and Native children who are knowledgeable or who are Native into a cognitive dissonance. Native kids have to read, to fill out those worksheets like that one I started with. How do they process the rest of the day? How are they going to pay attention to what the teacher's trying to teach when all they have in mind is, I have an Indian name. Why do I have to do this worksheet? There are research studies that show why all of this matters. Native students have higher dropout rates and higher suicide rates than other demographics. I do think we as educators have a role to play in interrupting both the dropout and the suicide rates by making better choices. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop in 1992 brought forth a metaphor that books can be mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. The important piece right now is that books can be mirrors if they look something like you. Here is a part of a graphic. I'm going to show you the rest of it in just a second. A graphic that came out in 2018. This is data from the Children's Book Center in Madison, Wisconsin. This is a white child, and you see that white child has lots of mirrors. That is because in the world of publishing, most of the books that come out are ones that reflect white characters, white children, white families. When you look at the rest of the graphic, you see the disparity. There are actually more books that feature animals, crayons, trucks as main characters. This stuff makes me shake. Then there are children shown on the left. Of course, today we're going to be talking about American Indians, but look at the data for Latina, Asian American, and African American children. When you look at the mirror, when you look at the graphic, you see that they have smaller mirrors and that shrink as you go further to the left to reflect the smaller number that gets published. But you also have to look at their feet, because even though there were 23 books that came out in 2018 that got categorized as being mirrors that had enough Native content in them to be called a Native American book, some of them were written by people who don't know what they're talking about, and they're stereotyping. There's bias. So not all their mirrors are good mirrors. This graphic is very powerful because it gets at the entirety of what is coming out in publishing today. It changes each year by tiny, tiny bit. That 1% was actually 0.09. And in the years since then, it's gone up just another 0.01 percentage. The numbers are increasing, but not enough. We all need books that affirm lives of Native children, our families, and our nations, because we have such a dark history. We have been through in this country periods of assimilation that were actually quite destructive. You all know about the Indian Wars, but do you know that in the 1800s, the United States set up government boarding schools where the motto was to kill the Indian and save the man? That photograph that you're looking on the right was a marketing campaign to try and get people to donate to these schools. What you see on the left was a young man who arrived at the boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, wearing his traditional clothing, and that was taken away. His hair was cut. Clothing was taken away and replaced by, in most schools, uniforms, like army uniforms. And you see the picture on the right shows him looking more like a white person than a Native person. That was the goal, to kill the Indian and save the man. And this marketing campaign was used to try and make people see that it was bad to be Native, it was better to be white, and so they would contribute to these schools. That was in the 1800s. The schools ended in the 1930s, but in the 1950s, other government policies were developed to try to get rid of us, to erase us from our homelands. In the 1950s, we saw termination and relocation. Termination was a period when the government said, yeah, you're not a tribe anymore. Your nation is done. And they had another program that said, we're going to move you. If you want to work in the big cities, we'll help you get there. We'll give you some job training. Sounds good, yes, but the ultimate goal was to get us off the reservations, to break up our nations, to weaken our communities. And then in 1958, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had this thing called the Indian Adoption Project, where Native children were placed in white homes. Another effort to break up our communities, our nations. So you're pushing against a whole lot. We've been pushing back, of course. We're still here because our people, our ancestors, have never given up. We continue to fight. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in Congress. It was a program, it was a law that said that tribal nations have jurisdiction over the placement of their children of tribal nations. It meant that Native children couldn't be kidnapped and taken away and placed into white foster or adoptive homes. However, tomorrow, November 9th, 2022, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case called Brackeen v. Holland, in which a family, the Brackeens, is saying, that's a racist law, in order to just tell me, white family, that I can't have a Native kid. It's not a racist law. It's a political law that was designed to protect Native communities, to have Native kids be placed within their communities so their culture could be part of their upbringing. We don't know what's going to happen. Native people across the United States are very shaken to see the Supreme Court taking up this particular case. I'm hopeful, though, because First Alameda, and those of you who are here today, you're here because you're wanting to choose children's books for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that means being aware of the long history of policies designed to destroy Native nations by destroying our children. You've chosen to say no to destroying our children. You've chosen to lift and affirm the lives of Native children. So a quick look at sovereignty and what that means. Right now, there's over 500 tribal nations in the United States. There's over 100 tribal nations in California. I keep using the word nations because it matters. When Europeans came here, they saw that we were not primitive, wild Indians, as shown in way too many children's books. We were social communities that had leaders, and so they entered into diplomacy. Leaders of native nations and leaders of European nations and then the United States nation signed treaties. This is all part of what it means to be sovereign, to have sovereignty part of our existence today. We're here because our diplomacy, the leadership of our tribal leaders, protected our existence as nations. This is so very important. Most people are taught to think of us as peoples with culture, with song and dance and language, but at the heart of it all is our status as nations. That's at the heart of it all. There's hundreds of nations and hundreds of treaties that are unique in so many ways. Here's one example. If you are a person that does crossword puzzles, undoubtedly you have come across the clue that says Native American infant, and you knew what the answer was. If you're a crossword puzzler, you've seen it before. The answer is supposed to be papoose. But again, think back to what I said earlier. Papoose is not the Native American word for baby. That is one people's. In fact, it's the Narragansett word for infant. These little things pop up all over the place. They're what we call in educational and sociological spaces, microaggressions, things that just kind of bang away and misrepresent and continue to hurt people. In the current area that we're working in right now, I'm in Redwood City, and we are on Ohlone land. That's important. You should know that word. You should know who the Ohlone people are. Pomo. I was working with the Native American parents in the San Francisco Unified School District recently. There's Pomo families. The Pomo Nation is north of San Francisco. I also learned there's a lot of Diné or Navajo families in this area, so you should become familiar with them. There's a lot of Cherokees as well. So when I'm evaluating books, what I look for is bringing all this information that I've been giving you so far into this criteria. I look for books by Native writers because Native people know what they're talking about. I look for tribally specific writing. That means they name the tribe they're talking about. I look for books that are set in the present day because we are very much part of American society today. We're not just long ago and far away like we see in those pioneer books. I look for images that accurately reflects who we are and our tribally specific aspects of our cultures. So I'm looking at all the pieces on the page. Does this match what it should match? If this is a Pueblo story, is this a Pueblo dress in the illustration? How can I tell? How would I know? How can you find out? I look for references to sovereignty, and I look for the use of present tense verbs. That's so important to me. I want writers to have the present tense verbs in their books or the present tense settings. That all by itself pushes against the idea that we don't exist anymore. So we're going to do a dive into this book. This is Fry Bread. It is a Native American family story, and I did encourage you not to go for Native American as a term that you would use, but that's just because this topic, Fry Bread, applies to lots of different nations across the United States. In Fry Bread, you see an author's note. This is a new development in children's books. Authors are being given more and more space than ever before to give you, the adult who's going to use the book with children, space to talk about the contents of the book. So here we have this book by Kevin Noble Maillard. In the author's note, he does talk about his identity. There's this recipe, this chunk here. My recipe for fry bread uses cornmeal, and he says it reflects the blending of African American and Native American cultures in my family. So you're learning here that he's Native American. If you do a website, a Google search on his name, you will find his website where you will learn that he is a citizen of the Seminole Nation. Many Native writers today have their own website, so you can search on a person's name and find out where they're from, what their nation is. As one thing that was absolutely terrific about Kevin's book is that when you open it on the end papers, you just see hundreds of names because they put tribal names, the names of tribal nations on the front end pages, on the back end pages, and scattered on a few pages inside the book. This was so exciting. Native people across the country were searching these pages to find the name of their nation. And we had a little campaign where we had people point to their name and share it on social media. We were all being given a mirror just by the names of our nations being included in the pages of the book. So this is the start of fry bread. Fry bread is food: flour, salt, water, cornmeal, baking powder, perhaps milk, maybe sugar, all mixed together in a big bowl. So what I'm calling attention to here is that on every page of this book, Kevin has used the present tense verb is. Fry bread is food. I love seeing that. Also, throughout the pages on this book, you will see a range of skin color, hairstyle, hair color, hairstyle that gets at the diversity of who we are. You're not native because you have dark hair and maybe some high cheekbones and maybe darker skin. That's not what makes you native. What makes you native is your family, and your family being part of a nation. Doesn't matter what you look like. That's a misunderstanding of who we are as native peoples. So I love this book because here you see that there's a range of what we look like that has been shown on the pages of this family that is making fry bread. Fry bread is shape. Fry bread is sound. And here I want to call attention to the we're emphasizing the word is, but also as you read through this book, you're going to see many cues visually that this book is set in the present day. You're looking at a gas stove where they're cooking, and a modern day skillet, and a modern day a set of tongs. There are all these things that are little tiny, kind of subtle cues that we are part of the present day. Also, of course, the little boy in his glasses. By the way, that's the author's son. And the clothing that the children are wearing, definitely part of the present day. Fry bread is color. Fry bread is flavor. Fry bread is time. And of course, I'm not reading all of the text on each page. I'm mostly trying to give you a sense of what the book is about. Fry bread is art. And here, this page, I want to pause and call attention to the woman on the far left, the skirt that she's wearing, and the dolls on the far right. Seminole kids see this and their little hearts soar, because that's Seminole stuff. That's Seminole skirts and dresses that we are looking at on that page. It is tribally specific information. Fry bread is history. Fry bread is place. And here, fry bread is nation. As I noted earlier, it's really important to me that we see the word nation in materials that we're giving to kids, and that adults understand what that means. Here, throughout Kevin's book, we see the word nation quite a lot. And in the author's note on the back, he has an extensive note about nationhood, about sovereignty. And you can read that and learn a little bit about that. So this book, Fry Bread is Everything. It really is everything because it offers so much. We're getting to the closing pages of the book, and this page I like because of that photograph that's there on the wall. We all have photographs of family members, the black and white photographs of family members on our walls. Fry bread is you. So now I guess I want to think about some small group work. I don't know if how you feel about the small group work right now, but what we're going to do is take a first attempt at analyzing the content of a children's book. We asked you to bring a book. Some of you were able to, some of you were not. That doesn't matter. If you don't have one with you, or if you don't have one in mind, we have some suggestions for that. Leah is going to break you into small groups, and the things that, and we're going to leave this particular slide up, and what I want you to look at or look for, we have about 10 minutes for this, is the writer or the illustrator native? Remember, you can look in the book to find out if that information is in there anywhere, or you can go online and do a search on their name. Does the book avoid generalizations? Does it use tribally specific words instead? Is it set in the present day? Does it accurately reflect a range of appearance? Does it have tribally specific aspects of the nations being depicted? That's those Seminole dresses that were in there. Are there references to sovereignty? Does the book use present tense verbs? Those are the things I want you to look at for the next 10 minutes or so. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let Leah take it from here, and we'll come back later.
Welcome back, everybody. Everyone's back from the breakouts.
Okay, so at this point, we have another hour or so of content and conversation, but I want to know how your small group work looked like. What sorts of things that people share. You can unmute. You can unmute and go ahead and speak. I'm not going to call on anybody.
I shared the book Jingle Dress, sorry. And then also Beauty Beside Me, which is written in English and Navajo.
And so yeah, so as long as we have proof in their files, that works.
I didn't hear that last. Valerie, can you finish what you were saying?
Just that it comes with a CD, so you can hear the Navajo as well as read the Navajo in the book.
And is it by a Navajo writer?
Yes, it's by Bahe White Thorn Senior.
Yes, right. I know another of
He
his
has
books. I don't
several.
know that, but I do know some of his other work.
Yeah.
And that was called Beauty Beside Me?
Yes.
Okay.
We shared some books in our group as well. I know Erica found one that sounded problematic, and and I brought one that actually I just ordered because we were going for a trip to Disneyland, and I know I didn't realize, because I haven't really been there since I was a kid, how many problematic images there were of Native Americans there, that I'm bringing my children here. And so we ordered It's a Small World.
Oh, yeah.
And this is new, like I don't know when this was published, but I can look in the front. But anyway, the one section on America, in this book and in the ride is like happy white farmers and this.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the actual ride looks a lot like that.
Yeah. Well,
I've
yeah,
been-
I think it's supposed to be just the ride. This is 2021 copyright. So, I mean, obviously the ride needs to be fixed, but here's the book about it. So interesting.
And that's a little golden book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's important that we recognize what kinds of books we're talking about, because Little
Mhm.
Golden is everywhere. Everybody can buy it.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, and it's not just Native misrepresentations in there. It does it to everybody.
It does it to everybody. Is that equitable? If everybody's
Except for white people. Yeah, I'm speaking very honestly that often
That's true.
white culture is presented as like a normal, and everybody else is different, and everybody else is exotic, and we tend to think, well, that's what they are like all the time. And for a lot of that, people wear certain clothing for a certain reason. It's not something they wear all the time, and so they contribute to these ideas of exotic otherness. Do we have one more person who wants to share before I start talking again? I am a teacher. I started out when I was like 5 years old trying to teach my little sisters, because I like to share what I know. And I study children's books, and I have a lot to say.
I can share. Hi, I'm Yosmai, and I work as a librarian. So I've actually shared with my group several of one of the book lists for younger kids, kind of on the same question. Many of the criteria that you offered, Debbie, were some of my criteria for creating the book list, and also could offer Heyday Books as a really great resource in terms of California Native representation, which I know some folks in our group were talking about being able to find some books for particular tribes or First Nation communities in Canada, but California Native focused books were more challenging. So I'm happy to drop in the chat. It's a book list for Alameda County Library, which is where I work, but you could find these books anywhere.
Okay, I do want it. Can somebody email? Can you email it to me? Because I have what I'm going to do next is going to include some work with the Alameda County cataloging.
Ooh, that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's it. Towards the last of the next session, I'm going to look at some books that are in there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. Is that okay, Leah?
Yep, sounds great.
Okay, so all right, so next we are going to talk about about exemplary books. So I talked about Fry Bread. That is an exemplary book, and I want everybody to have that in there, because one of the things that, oh, I didn't get your first name, just said that people are looking for books about California natives, California Native nations. They are named. There is a textual representation of those nations in the end papers of Fry Bread. So people can actually find that. And I have no doubt that some of the Native families in the California tribal nations are making fry bread for one event or another. So Fry Bread works as an exemplary book. But I want to do a close look at two more. I'm trying to be in the feel-good mood for a little bit. So this is Forever Cousins by Laurel Goodluck, and the illustrations are by Jonathan Nelson. She's Mandan, Hidatsa, and Chimshin, and he is Dene. Forever Cousins is a very important book. It tells us about these two little girls on the cover. It's a story about them. It's a picture book, and they hang out together. They agree that sunflowers are beautiful, powwow dancing is fun, and choke cherry jam on toast is the best. So clearly we're talking about two kids who are native. But they do other things. They go play with sunflowers, and they like to eat choke cherry jam. So the page captures both their identities as just kids running around, but also as people of a community, of a tribal nation. So you see all of that on the page. Now, what's going to happen as you turn the pages is that the little girls are going to separate, because one of the families is going to go back to the reservation. On the left is the little girl who's staying. She is staying as she and her family are part of a very large urban Indian community in the San Francisco Bay Area. So what you're seeing there is she's sitting on a chair. She's sad. She's missing her good friend. In the background, you see the tall buildings of an urban area. This is a powwow scene in an urban area. On the right is her friend, her cousin, who's no longer in that urban area. That cousin is now on the reservation. She too is at a powwow, and you see behind her the hills of the area of the reservation that they're at. So you have the life experience of an urban child and a reservation child in this book. Key piece, though, for all of you in this gathering today is that this book starts out in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, the two girls stay in touch. They're very sad at the parting. They're sad at the beginning, but they find out ways to stay in touch. And of course, they're using their cell phones. So you see this page as you read the book, they're using their cell phones to show each other lunch boxes and backpacks that they've bought for the new school years. This is so important. It seems like a nothing, but really, you would be surprised how many people are surprised that Native people have technology. They seem to think that if you have technology, you can't be a real Native. That's part of that power of stereotyping that I was talking about earlier. This book pushes back on that very beautifully with the visuals in it. Part of why I like this book is that we moved from my home reservation when my daughter was 3 to be living and working in an urban area, actually in Illinois, for graduate school. In this case, in our case, when we would drive home to go back home for gatherings and holidays and things like that, when we crossed the border from Texas into New Mexico, we were like, yes, excited and happy because we are almost there. And that's what's captured in this page, that idea that Native people are traveling, they're going home, they're going to reunions, and it's a joyful time. And they're in cars. A few years ago when I was doing classroom visitations in Illinois, kids were surprised that I arrived in a car. Kids would greet me at the door to the classroom, and they'd be looking around for my horse. Again, that's the power of stereotyping. Simple things like books that have us in cars push against that idea. This is the very last page of the book. This is from the reunion moment in the book, in the story when the family is gathered for a ceremony. There's a scent of sweetgrass and burning sage. There's the beat of the drum in an ancient song, and Magu explains relationships, and that new baby there is getting a Hidatsa name. It's a tribally specific book. It names tribes in it, and the huge plus, as I mentioned earlier, is that children's books today have author's notes that help you as the adult use the book in your classroom. This author's note starts out with cousins, community, culture, and connections. And it talks about the author having grown up in the 1670s in California's Bay Area suburbs. They called it the city, and they're an intertribal native family, which is important because we do have many, many nations who are part of urban areas like the California Bay Area, who have a father of one nation and a mother of another nation. So they are intertribal identities that come into play. So here is a little bit of information about that. Here is another clip of the author's note where she talks about citizenship, that they are enrolled members of sovereign tribal nations and citizens of the United States, that the term sovereign nation means a tribal nation that governs itself. Really solid information there that you can use. And here, a reference to the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. Earlier in the presentation today, I talked about efforts to assimilate Native people, and one of those was a relocation program where the federal government invited Native people to move to urban areas to get job training. That's the case. That's the story of this particular author. Her family did that. They went to the urban area through the Indian Relocation Act. And so that's why she grew up there. So really good information in that book. Here's another one that I'm really excited about. It's called We Are Still Here. It's by Tracy Sorrell. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. That's the cover of her book. And again, we're talking about exemplary books and what makes them exemplary. Zooming in on the cover of this book, you see that range of physical appearance that I was talking about. These kids don't look alike. They don't all have dark hair and dark skin because we as people don't. I'm just going to say that again. What you look like is not what makes you Native. What makes you Native is being a citizen of a tribal nation. And so when you look at these kids here, they're all carrying a flag because flags are symbols of a nation. All the tribal nations in the United States have our own unique flags. You can go to the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. and see those flags because they have them draped and hanging in various places of the museum itself. So really cool information when you focus for just a moment on part of an illustration. This is the refrain that we see throughout the book. We are still here, and it really bugs me that we have to say that, but we do. People think like the taxi cab experiences that many of us have, especially when we're in major areas like New York City. You get in the cab and say who you are because taxi cab drivers sometimes are quite chatty. They want to know who you are, where you're from, and over Native people recount having gotten into a cab and saying that they're a Native person in the cab. He turns around, looks at them and thinks, you're kidding. I thought you guys were all dead. Well, we're not. So the refrain, we are still here, is important and sad that it has to be a refrain, that it's something that we have to assert today. This, as the book unfolds, you see that we're looking at a classroom, and the teacher is assigning kids various topics for their Indigenous Peoples Day project. And you see there in particular, self-determination, Indian Child Welfare Act. I referred to that earlier, things I've talked about, relocation, termination. They're all packed into this book in very nice chunks of information. Here are the 2 pages on termination, about when the United States government decided to stop honoring treaty agreements with over 100 Native nations and terminated them, just said, you don't exist anymore, you're not a nation anymore. Hand in hand with that was relocation. Again, this is when the federal government invited people to leave their homelands and live in urban areas. And so you see that as part of the book. You see them coming off of the bus. That relocation worked for some people, but did not work for many. That's an important thing to know, its successes and its failures. One of its successes was that it brought Native people together, got off those buses and looked for other Native people. And so Native communities were formed in these major urban areas. And San Francisco Bay Area is known historically for some of the tribal activism that took place here. So that's the page in the book. There on the left, you see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. You see a boat in the foreground. This is Alcatraz. This is when Native people who were growing up during the 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area occupied Alcatraz Island. So that's included in this book. Because you guys are all working With young children, I'm sure that you're interested in board books. And so if you come to my website, and I'm going to show you a picture of that later, but somebody can look up American Indians and children's literature and drop it in the chat. It's easy to find. You'll find the website, and you'll find that I have a best books tab where I provide lists of books that I recommend. They've all been read carefully, and I've written about all the ones that I recommend. So these are board books. Bouchou, Come Play With Us. I really like that one because it's a simple board book that features Ojibwe children. In the background, you see it's an Ojibwe classroom because on the walls are Ojibwe woodlands designs. Bouchou is an Ojibwe word. And as you turn the pages of that, you see the things that you see in any classroom of early childhood settings or centers. And the words there for the words in the book are provided in English and in Ojibwe. Terrific book. I See Me, also a really nice little board book about Native children and what they do in their daily lives. We All Count is a counting book with Cree numbers throughout. Excellent, beautiful book by Julie Flett. Her art has won many, many awards in Canada in particular. A Welcome Song for Baby on the top right is by Richard Van Camp. I love that book. I love anything that Richard Van Camp does, and that's a rare thing to be able to say because he's prolific, and one book after another has been outstanding. On the bottom left is Monique Gray Smith's My Heart Fills with Happiness, and it's about the moments of joy in the life of a Native child, times when her heart fills with happiness. Gorgeous little book. These two on the bottom right are new. Mittens and Mucklucks and Button Up are two books that came out of a publisher that's emphasizing Alaska. We all tend to think about Alaska people as being Eskimos, which is not the word they use for themselves. And we tend to associate life in Alaska as one with igloos, ice homes, snow homes, and this series that includes Mittens and Mucklucks and Button Up really pushes against the stereotyping that we see about Alaska Native peoples. So you could come to my website and find these board books and others as well, because there are many, and they are absolutely delightful. Now is where we're going to talk about your library, your Alameda County Library. And what I want to do is talk about traditional stories, because one of the things that I did when I was teaching kindergarten was I would bring in folk stories, folklore, like Little Red Riding Hood and the Three Bears and the Billy Goat's Gruff. So we're going to talk a little bit about folklore. I pulled up the search window and entered some titles in the search box to see what I'm going to show you here. When you do a search on the Three Bears, there's a cover of the Three Bears. Probably the most popular Three Bears book is the one by Paul Galdone. And when you look at the subject classification for that, you see bears, folklore, folklore, and you see the genre that's listed there is folklore. So we have an idea, okay, this is a folklore, the stories that people tell, and oral tradition, and passing on from one generation to the next, the stories. And you see on the cover, it's a folk tale classic. So we all know this story. It's probably part of most of the classrooms, early childhood classrooms that are part of your service area. So folklore is what we're talking about. When I do that search for this book on the left, you see an Indigenous language at the top. It's Tlingit. The English title is Salmon Boy. This book is written by several people who are Tlingit. You look at the right, the subject and genre, and what do we see? Folklore, 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 over and over again. The genre, folktales, and picture books. Some of these stories, however, are about how the world came to be. Some of the stories that Native people tell are about how such and such a thing came to be part of their world. That's a lot like the stories that we see in the Bible or that come from the Bible, like Noah's Ark. Most of us are familiar with Noah's Ark. It's a big piece of Christian teachings, and we've seen a lot of information about Noah's Ark. It's very popular. But when we look at the subject area for that, and it doesn't have a genre, in the card catalog, I did not see a genre for this book, but it doesn't say folklore. But that's what it is. It's a story that the people tell about how a certain thing came to be. But we don't call that one folklore. Why not? Why do Native people stories get called folklore and Christian stories are not? That's a disparity in the way that institutions catalog and think about children's books by Native people. That's a problem because it contributes or invites a trivialization of stories that are sacred to us. Here again is the salmon boy, and what I'm talking about in the lack of understanding, I'm just going to do this right away. What you're seeing on the right are many very famous, much loved tellings of traditional stories that were done by people who are not Native. I think it's vitally important that traditional stories be told or published, written by people who are of the nation the story is about, because we know what to share and what not to share. There's such a long history of our religious ways being misrepresented. And the outcome of that was there was a shutting down of Native traditions. You could get in trouble, you could be persecuted for doing your religion. And so Native people have become very guarded about that. We have what I'm calling in my writings a curtain. We don't share everything. There are certain times that we draw the curtains. We don't want to share all of these things with you because there's a history of somebody misrepresenting it. What we see on the right are these classic, very popular books. None of them are by Native people. All of them are highly problematic. We don't know where Tommy DePella got those stories from. I do know where Penny Pollack got her Turkey Girl, because I've done a lot of research and writing about that. Paul Goebel, Dakota and Lakota people do not like the stories that he tells because he misrepresents their culture and their cultural teachings. Frog Girl is by Paul Owen Lewis, is one of several books that he's done where he just like cherry picks from very different nations and puts them all together in a single book. And it looks like a Native story, but it's not. It's his made up story. Arrow to the Sun by Gerald McDermott. It says it's a Pueblo Indian tale, but you know, there's 19 different Pueblos in New Mexico. I'm from one of the northern Pueblos. We're not at all the same as the ones that are in the southern part of the state. We're very different. So where did this story come from? We don't know. We're not given that information. So I'm really encouraging you not to use these folk tales that are written by people who are not of that particular tribe. I think you should avoid that. I really think that you should instead reach for books that are set in the present day. And again, that's an echo of what I've been saying all morning. Books set in the present day, books by Native writers because they know what they're doing. You're here looking at on the left the cover for Jingle Dancer by Cynthia Lytix Smith. It came out in 2000 and came out again, newly issued last year. You should be able to find it easily. It's about a little girl who's going to do the jingle dance for the first time at the local powwow. And in the book, she starts by wanting to learn the dance and how she learns the dance that she's going to be doing and how her family helps her because she has to learn a song, she has to learn a dance, and she has to put the regalia together that she's going to wear. It's not a costume, it's regalia. That's another biggie in thinking about Native people. We don't wear costumes. We have clothing that has roots in who our people have been historically. It's not dress up. It's not play. It's not costume. It's important to us. So Jingle Dancer is about her getting ready to be part of the community that's going to dance at the local powwow. I really like this book. Part of what you see as the little girl Jenna is going through the process of learning to take part in this, that she's feeling overwhelmed. She's feeling like she can't quite do it. But she goes to visit her great aunt Sis, who told her a Native story, a traditional teaching that helps her. That's kind of how Native families are across the country. That's how non-Native families are too, ones who draw upon cultural or religious teachings to help you make it through something that's difficult. And that's exactly what we see here, that Cynthia Lytix Smith is telling Jenna through Great Aunt Sis at this part of the story, a traditional story. Here, again, she's feeling overwhelmed, and Great Aunt Sis told Jenna a Muskogee Creek story about Bat. Although other animals had said he was too small to make a difference, Bat won a ball game by flying high and catching a ball in his mouth. Great Aunt Sis is using a traditional story to tell Jenna, hang in there, you're going to do it, it's going to be okay. So the story, the traditional teaching is in just this page of the book. It's not the entire book in the way that Legend of the Bluebonnet, that's all that story is about. And again, we don't know the authenticity or the accuracy of any of these tellings unless somebody takes time to do a deep dive into researching them. Just don't use them. Reach instead for books by Native writers where you start out with characters in the present day who are experiencing something like, in this case, a dance for the first time. Here we are going to pause for some discussion where you can share what you think about the presentation content and how what I have shared might change what you do or what you might ask people you work with to do. Maybe you just want to have a conversation with people. And so that's kind of what I wanted to do now. For the next, I don't know how long this would take, another 10 or 15 minutes maybe. And we can do that as the whole group. Does that make sense, Leah? Am I making sense?
Yes, that sounds great.
So we're talking about application of information to what you see happening in schools or classrooms that you work with, what you see others doing, for example. It doesn't have to be you. It's anxiety producing to talk about our own practice. Go ahead, Erica.
So I think it prompts me to ask our staff to actually review the books before we put them out there. One of the things that my executive director wanted us to do was, okay, it's Native American History Month. We want you to talk about Native Americans and Thanksgiving. And so my thought was the two don't quite go together, but but maybe we can talk about, Native Americans in a more educated way, in a way that's more sensitive and relevant than what we're seeing. And so we have a number of those books that we shouldn't be using, and we have a few that we should. So I think it would be good if we kind of, had like a staff meeting where we're like, look, this is why we're not going to use this book. This is, and this is why we are. Just kind of sharing this information would really be helpful for our staff.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that you have both and that you want people to reconsider why you have the ones that are problematic. That's terrific. Thank you.
Mhm.
Also, I will say here that a lot of what you see on my website, I started that website in 2006, and sometimes I'm doing a lot of work and sometimes I'm not. It depends on what my life is like. I don't get paid to do that. This is not a hobby, but it's something that I do. I started that blog in 2006 because I was at the time I was a professor at a university, and all of the things that I was publishing were behind paywalls. They were part of the publications that were put forth by professional associations like National Council for Teachers of English. And I was a teacher. I could never afford to be a member of those associations. So I decided I had to use the internet, to use social media to put the work out there and make it available. So starting in 2006, I started writing about the children's books that I was writing about in places that teachers couldn't access. So it's on the blog. And a lot of that came to be there because a teacher wrote to me, an administrator wrote to me, a librarian wrote to me and said, I have this book in my collection. A parent brought this book in, whatever way it came to be in their hands, they need help. And so write to me because I will help. I will do what I can to research the content of that book, and it will probably turn into a blog post. And I will not say your name. I will not say where you are. I'm trying to protect you because there's tremendous backlash when people speak up. You need help? I'm willing to help. You're not the only one who's asking about that book. There's probably people across the country that want to know about that book. So use me as a resource, as someone you can write to for help about a particular book. When you do that, I want you to write in the subject line that you were in this particular workshop, because that will bump you up in the queue. So I'll pay more immediate attention to your request than I might otherwise.
Thank you.
So I see that Carrie made a comment in the chat, She said, I will be making an effort to find books that are present day and by Native American authors. And Marta said, share what I learned today with my staff. Purchase some of the books that were shared today. We have a few more comments. Daisy wrote, I agree to review the books and find books with Native American authors. The presentation is very educational for me to bring back to our Head Start program in San Francisco. Thanks. Does anybody else have any comments? You're welcome to unmute or chat.
I have those key pieces there that I think I'm hearing all of you saying these kinds of things in your feedback about today and how you'll use the information.
This is Yosmai. I can offer, I know it's a little different because I'm work in a public library, but because I engage with the public and a lot of folks come in. So for example, the mission projects in 3rd grade, right? That people come in, parents come in. Yes, I saw the warranted eye roll, you know, and it's like, it's an opportunity for me or for other library folks to actually interrupt that or start a different type of conversation. So I think, you know, there's opportunities to be resources in our work, resources in our own families and communities, you know, and just, I think a lot of folks, even here, right, they're like, what kid books, what 0 to 5 books, that there are ways we can, you know, be resources both in doing the work and sharing the information and kind of taking those small opportunities for us, whether it's like the parent coming in for the project or we do craft kits. And so we always, you know, we quote unquote call them craft kits or, you know, but we try to utilize that activity as a way to talk about bigger social kind of issues with parents. And so, yeah, I guess just finding creative ways to do that.
It's really hard because we have hundreds of years of playing Indian, of romanticizing what it means to be Native, and people aren't doing any of this from a malicious way. It's very much from a space of ignorance, of not knowing better, because we just have had so much time of being exposed to problematic ways of thinking about Native people. One of the other things that comes up a lot right now is Thanksgiving. And of course, there's all kinds of worksheets happening. Lots of stories are being read. Many school districts have a reenactment of that quote unquote first Thanksgiving, where kids are dressing up either as a pilgrim or an Indian, and they're coming together to have a meal. On my website, I have written about a family that was in California, who the teacher sent home information that they were going to be doing that reenactment. And she was, the mother was a professor of American Indian Studies, she's Seneca, and she wrote back to the teacher about why it was problematic to do those kinds of reenactments around the first Thanksgiving. And that's all it took. The teacher read that and was like, duh, right, of course. It was just a light bulb moment that somebody needed to help her flip that switch. And she got that from the mother's email. And she talked to the other teachers in the building, and they were like, oh, right. They also understood that. It's just that somebody has to say it. And then it becomes, you go from 0 to 90 to want to being in a different place. And they went to the principal, and the principal said, that's right. And they went to the sister school and they said, yeah, we shouldn't do that. We're not going to do that. And so they sent out an email to parents that they were not going to do that. Parents were very upset. This became a story on CNN, on all the national news networks were carrying this story. How dare this school bow to political correctness? How dare this school let this one family change what was been done for decades? Everybody had fond memories of making their little construction paper headdress and feathers and their paper bag vest. they all had fond memories of doing that. And suddenly to have someone say, it's actually not a good idea, was upsetting. So the district relented and they went ahead and did that. The Native parents kept their kids home from school that day, but in the weeks up to that time, the mother who was walking her Native child to school, they were yelled at, they were surrounded, they were screamed at. It was very unpleasant to be a Native person going to school in that district at that point. I think that's what we're seeing right now. Native families across classrooms, across districts in this country are making decisions about how they're going to navigate this moment with their kid who is going to be asked to play Indian in a classroom reenactment of the first Thanksgiving. There's so many children's books that tell that story, that do that. It's not okay. It's just not okay. And we have to get to a space collectively as a country where we stop doing those kinds of things.
So I see a comment from Winona. She says, I agree that I would like to bring this information back to our staff to review the books we have on in our classrooms. And also I'm planning to send a note to my niece's teacher, as she recently showed me that Island of the Blue Dolphin is recommended reading from her teacher. She says, on the same day I listened to your earlier webinar, so thank you for providing that important education for me. And we have a question from Lisa that says,
wait. Before we do that, let's pause for a moment to talk about
sure.
Island of the Blue Dolphins, because I did bring it up in the session we had last week.
Oh yeah, great.
Island of the Blue Dolphins is one of the books that I had on that big screen where I did the big red X across award-winning books. Island of the Blue Dolphins is a big book in California. Classrooms across the state use it because they think, well, it won a Newbery Award and it's about Native people, except it's not. It's a creation, a fiction of what someone thinks Native people were like. It's written by Scott Odell, and it's supposedly a strong female book because it's about how this woman persevered. Actually, she didn't persevere. They brought her from that island to a mission where she died. And Scott Odell, made up her life on that island. He made up her life, her language, her culture. He just made it all up. And people think that it's actually a good story about Native people. And it's not. It's all fictionalized. And what I mentioned in that seminar last week was that one of the more popular and famous children's book authors is I can't think of her name. She wrote Because of Winn-Dixie, Kate DiCamillo. She's written several books that are very popular, and she has huge following on social media. A couple of weeks ago, she talked about the experience of having a teacher read aloud in the classroom and how fond that is a memory for her. And the book she remembered being read to her was Island of the Blue Dolphins. And she posted about that on Facebook. People mostly on Facebook were responding to her as, yeah, I remember reading that. I remember my teacher reading a book too. And they all had fond memories. It's the power of reading aloud that they were talking about. Many of them talked about other problematic books with Native content in them that is not okay. When Native people saw that she was sharing Island of the Blue Dolphins, there was a lot of conversations in Native circles. Not that book again, please, not that book again. And I wrote an open letter to her, and I don't know her. I just hoped that she would see it. And in fact, she did. And she listened to what I said. She read my blog post about the book and what's wrong with the book. And she also paid attention to the experience of an Aleut child during the read aloud of that when she was a kid. That Aleut child is Eve Tuck. She is now a professor of education. And when she saw me talking about Island of the Blue Dolphins on Twitter, she replied about her experience and how her classmates were treating her when their teacher was reading that book aloud to her when she was a kid. It's not a pleasant experience. So that information is available to us now because of social media, and it was available to Kate DiCamillo. And so she did a follow-up post and she said, I was wrong to share Island of the Blue Dolphins. I want everybody to read what Debbie Reese has said about that book. And it's a powerful moment of how we can hear information and use information and change what we do. Okay, that's it on that.
Awesome. Thank you. So Lisa asked a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the books by Bird Baylor.
Yeah, she's also she's another very famous writer. I could have put her on that book where on that page where I put a big red X, because some of her books look like they're set in the Southwest, but the content is very generic. It's not tribally specific. It's very romantic in some places. So no, I don't recommend Bird Baylor's books either. And people also ask me about Paddle to the Sea by Hollingsworth, I think is the author's name. These are things that somebody gave to us, that somebody read to us, and we want to know if they're okay or not. My first question is it by a Native writer? And if it's not, we're already at a different space in thinking about that book. We don't need books by non-Native writers. And this is not a question of censorship. This is about making space in a we the people space to bring Native people forward in our practice.
So Raymond made a comment. He says, we want to start a little library on our block for local children. I will use this criteria in selecting books and include an Indigenous people's focus.
Yay, definitely. If you have the money to do that, do it. And here's a screen capture of my blog. And in that top line there, in that gray chunk there, you see the best books tab. Somebody can go there and click on best books, and you'll see that I've been creating best books lists for several years. We also have nonfiction by Native writers and historical fiction. Just as much information as I can gather, I put it there on the website. It's all free. You can read it. Tips for teachers, that's a good one there. Developing instructional materials. I'm pushing that one out now, especially with that naming project going around.
Okay, and I just put the link to last week's training in the chat, but I'll also include it in the resources that I share out later, and also a link to your blog. Yeah, so are there any other questions, comments? I'll give everybody just a minute to type or to raise their hand if they want to, or just unmute. Okay, so I think that means that we are at the end of our presentation. I want to thank Debbie Reese so much for being with us for these last two trainings and for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. I want to thank everyone who attended today. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you coming and learning with us. I will be sending out a link to the evaluation at the end of probably in the afternoon after I have some lunch. Everybody have some lunch, that's important. We'll also be sending out a link to this recording and resources after the event. And everyone who attended today will be getting a copy of the Forever Cousins book sent to them, as long as you included your mailing information when you joined the meeting today. If you didn't include your mailing information, but you now realize why I was asking that question, you're welcome to email me back with your mailing information and I'll go ahead and get it out to you. Thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.